I thought buying the little craftsman bungalow on Willow Lane would be the start of my redemption arc. I was 38, divorced, broke, and carrying the kind of guilt that doesn't fade even when you pack it in boxes and drive across state lines. The house wasn't much: peeling paint, sagging porch, a yard that looked more like a jungle than a lawn, but it was mine. Or at least that's what the deed in my glove box told me. On the day I pulled up with a rented U-Haul, I barely had time to admire the crooked shutters before the front door swung open. A woman in a slate-gray blazer stepped out like she owned the place. She had sharp cheekbones, perfectly straight posture, and an embroidered badge pinned to her chest. Willow Hills Homeowners Association president. Her voice was calm, clipped, and terrifyingly confident. "You're trespassing," she said, looking at me like I was a squatter caught red-handed. "This property falls under Willow Hills HOA jurisdiction. The deed you're holding is invalid." My first reaction was to laugh. I told her there was no HOA, that I'd checked, double-checked, triple-checked. My realtor had sworn up and down the neighborhood was free from that nonsense. But she only smiled with that cold patience bureaucrats use on idiots and invited me inside, my own house, to show me the paperwork. Inside, my would-be living room had been transformed into something between a law office and a war bunker. Filing cabinets lined the walls, manila folders stacked in geometric towers, and a leather chair planted behind a mahogany desk like a throne. She handed me a binder thick enough to crush a small animal, filled with signatures, stamps, bylaws, and an official-looking revival of an HOA I was certain had dissolved decades ago. "My name is Margaret Cole," she said, "and under the reconstituted Willow Hills Charter, I have emergency oversight authority. Until your ownership dispute is resolved, I'll be occupying this property." I opened my mouth to argue, but froze when she called me by name. Not sir, not mister, but my name. That detail, spoken with surgical precision, was enough to chill my blood. That night, I slept in a sleeping bag on the bare floor, surrounded by boxes I was too afraid to unpack. I kept hearing her voice in my head, that confidence, that certainty. When someone wields paperwork like a blade, you start wondering if you missed something obvious, if maybe you're the crazy one. The next day, a knock came at the door. An elderly man with watery eyes and a stooped back introduced himself as Henry Walsh. He said he'd been treasurer of the old HOA back in the early 2000s. When I showed him Margaret's binder, his hands trembled as he examined the signatures. "I know these people," he whispered, "but two of them have been dead for years." He promised to check his data records and meet me the following evening. "Your life might depend on it," he added before shuffling away. The words hit me like a gut punch. What kind of neighborhood spat involved life or death stakes? By morning, it wasn't just Margaret. Posts started popping up on community boards, accusing me of running illegal renovations at dawn, of swearing at a woman walking her dog, of lurking near the bus stop where kids waited. None of it true, but all of it written with enough detail to sound real. Then came letters from city planning about unpermitted construction, from the tax assessor about suspicious improvements, even one from the Postal Service about mail disruptions. And finally, the masterpiece, an invoice from Willow Hills HOA demanding $62,000 in back dues, dating back 15 years, complete with breakdowns of late fees and special assessments. I hadn't even fixed a leaky faucet yet, but apparently I was already bankrupt. Around noon, a man named Paul showed up. Broad-shouldered, sunburned, the kind of guy who wore work boots like a second skin. He introduced himself as Margaret's cousin. He spoke with the earnestness of someone who believed he was on the right side of things. He said Margaret was just trying to restore order, that the neighborhood had fallen into disrepair and needed rules. He urged me to work with her, not against her. For a moment, I almost believed him. But then Margaret appeared at my mailbox later that day, smiling with the same coldness as before. She talked casually about workplace safety, about how companies should be held accountable when their negligence killed people. And then she mentioned a name, Brandon Pierce. My stomach dropped. Brandon had been a foreman on a construction site 2 years ago. He died when scaffolding collapsed. And I I had signed the safety inspection paperwork 2 weeks before the accident. That night, unable to sleep, I searched his name. The first article was brutal. Foreman killed in scaffolding collapse. Investigators questioned safety oversight. His photo showed a man in his 40s, with an easy smile, wearing a hard hat tilted back on his head. A paragraph down, I saw my own signature at the bottom of an inspection document. The same one I'd signed under pressure from my boss, telling myself the minor flaws were acceptable. Margaret knew. She knew my connection to Brandon's death. When she showed up at my back door the next evening, her eyes gleamed with hatred. "You signed off on the system that killed him," she said flatly. "My brother is dead because of you. And now you'll learn what it feels like to lose everything." I wanted to argue, to tell her I hadn't meant for anyone to get hurt, but the words dried up in my throat. She wasn't just a neighbor with a grudge. She was someone who had turned grief into a weapon. Things spiraled. Margaret organized a community safety meeting at the local VFW hall. I walked in to find rows of folding chairs, coffee urns, and neighbors lined up to testify about my so-called crimes. People I'd never met accused me of blasting power tools at dawn, of reckless driving, of hostile behavior. Each story rehearsed, coached, impossible to disprove. Margaret stood at the podium, poised and calm, painting me as a menace. By the end, the room buzzed with agreement. I didn't belong here. It spread beyond Willow Lane. My boss called me in after receiving complaints from something called the Neighborhood Standards Committee. A law firm requested my employment records. Then came an injunction filed in county court by Margaret, demanding my deed be voided and my house transferred to the HOA. I called a lawyer. He skimmed the paperwork, shook his head, and said it would take $20,000 minimum to fight, money I didn't have. "She knows what she's doing," he muttered. Then my sister called in tears. Child Protective Services had shown up at her door after anonymous reports about her kid's unsafe uncle. Her employer received a community safety alert. Even my elderly parents got phone calls from a so-called mediation service, telling them their son was spiraling into violence. Margaret wasn't just trying to ruin me. She was dismantling my family, piece by piece. That's when Paul came back, this time looking uneasy. He admitted he'd recorded Margaret coaching neighbors, fabricating complaints, orchestrating everything. But what he showed me next nearly made me collapse. A box full of files, each detailing previous projects, photos, letters, and community complaints aimed at 3 other men. Different towns, same playbook. One had killed himself. Across his photo, Margaret had scrawled in red ink, "Completed." This wasn't just revenge for her brother. She'd been doing this for years. Paul and I took the box to Detective Harris, a county fraud investigator. He laid the evidence out across a table, his jaw tightening with each page. Forged signatures from people long dead. HOA revival documents that never should have existed. Fake organizations, fake websites, fake neighbors. Enough to bury her in prison. But Margaret was always a step ahead. The night Harris briefed the neighborhood in Henry's living room, a storm raged outside. Lightning flickered, rain pounded, and then the power went out. In the sudden darkness, a voice drifted from the doorway, calm, cold, familiar. "You think charges will stop me?" Margaret said. That was plan A. Now we moved to plan B. By the time officers scrambled for flashlights, she was gone. Around midnight, glass shattered at my house. Through the storm, I saw a flashlight beam moving inside. Harris called for backup, but it would take 15 minutes in weather like this. So we went together, me, Paul, Henry, and half a dozen neighbors who'd finally realized they'd been pawns in her game. We found her in my living room, swinging a sledgehammer into the walls, smashing my computer, ripping apart the place I'd tried to call home. When she saw us, her eyes blazed. "You'll pay for Brandon," she hissed, "and anyone who stands with you will pay too." She charged. Paul blocked her swing with a chair. Henry screamed for help. Neighbors grabbed her arms. She fought like someone possessed, but eventually they pinned her to the floor until police burst in, soaked and panting. Margaret Cole was arrested that night for fraud, forgery, harassment, destruction of property, and assault with a deadly weapon. Later, prosecutors added conspiracy, identity theft, and wire fraud. She got 8 years in federal prison. In the months that followed, Willow Lane changed. Neighbors who'd testified against me apologized, some helping me rebuild what she'd destroyed. Paul founded a construction safety fund in Brandon's memory. Henry organized a new neighborhood council, transparent, democratic, accountable. 6 months later, we dedicated a small garden at the end of Willow Lane. Flowers, benches, a plaque engraved with Brandon's name. Kids play there now. Families sit and talk. It's a place of life, not vengeance. Sometimes I sit on that bench and think about Margaret's words. She wanted me to feel powerless, to know what it was like to lose everything because of someone else's decision. But what she never understood was that guilt doesn't vanish when someone ruins your life. It lingers until you decide to carry it differently. I'll always know my signature played a role in a man's death. Nothing can erase that. But I also know the difference between accountability and destruction, between building a community and burning one to the ground. Margaret wanted revenge. In the end, she gave us something else, a neighborhood worth fighting for.